Thank you for the question. It's an extremely important one because historic ideas of cities really neglect communications and particularly electronic communications. So it's a difficult thing for people from an urban planning background to consider the digital world. The digital world is profoundly invisible very often, and the infrastructures of the city, of the electronic and digital city, are not nearly as visible as those of physical transportation. So this pivotal question of the digitization of the city relies us to think of the relationship between face-to-face communication in the traditional way and this new and vastly expanding world of digital communication. And the crucial thing really is to see how those two things relate together. We're not living in a world which is entirely digital, which was the prediction of some of the theorists in the 1980s and 1990s. This was the idea that the city would somehow cease to exist because we would do everything through a sort of virtual world of what was called cyberspace. So now we have to manage the complex relationship between physical places, human people, bodies in places, physical architecture, physical transportation, and all of the digital systems, digital services, and digital infrastructures that overlap and connect with all of those activities. And the crucial question really, I think, is using a concept I used in the Berlin lecture, is the idea of what's called remediation. This is how digital technologies help us to reorganize transport systems, electricity systems, our bodily presence in the cities, our communication systems, our economic activities, our cultural activities. And those ideas of remediation are quite subtle and quite revealing because they show that we don't abandon all of the physical ballast of our lives and our cities, but we're able to reorganize them in really profound and important ways. This is where we come to the question of the smart city, which is a very popular and influential idea. And this is one idea of how the electronic and the physical city can be managed together. But I have problems with the idea because it's very much a top-down, technocratic, and corporate idea, all about building big digital systems through big technology corporations and implanting them into the city in a very top-down way. The history of that idea of the smart city is all about hype. It's all about selling a perfect future where the new technology will allow us to perfect the city and to build a sort of perfect utopian world. I think there are problems with that analysis and there are problems with that idea because cities get locked into a big corporate machine for building new information systems that are not necessarily appropriate to their needs, that are very expensive, that are very hard to maintain, and that are often privatized. So I think there's a lot more scope for more grassroots-based innovation in technology, for looking at the whole world of urban apps and community initiatives that can be more socially involving, that can be more socially equitable, because many of the traditional ideas of the smart city are actually quite elitist. They're about building sort of elitist new urban developments for the wealthy, for the technologically literate, for the technological elite. So the challenge really economically, I think, is to raise all of the elements of an urban economy using the creative possibilities of digital technology, digital apps, and so on, in a really an open and participatory way, rather than imposing it through a big sort of highly corporate IT solution, which is very expensive and which locks a city in to some of the big technology companies that are selling the idea of the smart city. And I think there are lots of interesting examples there. I mean, the idea of the smart city is very seductive. Okay, William Gibson, the famous author of the idea of cyberspace, he's a science fiction author. He argued that the future is already here; it's just unevenly distributed. And I think that's a really intriguing idea, because cities around the world are rushing very rapidly to not just embrace digital smart city ideas, but to build entirely new physical landscapes that are very futuristic in appearance, that are very futuristic in their superficial appeal. But many of those city districts and smart city developments are profoundly elitist and profoundly exclusionary, and very much geared towards a high technology minority. Very often these are built in terms of privatized governance, so they take away any sense of democratic accountability. Very often they are sold as a sort of sustainable, perfect world, whereas in fact, if you look at the actual ecological impacts of these developments, they're far higher than is being admitted. And also these smart city concepts raise big questions about social control and surveillance. And I think this is an area that's becoming increasingly obvious, particularly in Europe and North America, where some cities have gone for a sort of smart city model and then realize the degree to which they are basically giving over government control to big tech corporations to run parts of their city, sometimes parts of their infrastructure. In Toronto, for example, the city council got together with Google and Alphabet, two of the very big digital technology companies, to build a whole new district on the lakefront there. It was going to be called Sidewalk Labs. But it was so controversial because the community groups and the social groups in the city realized it was a very, very intense urban surveillance system that was basically grabbing personal data, harvesting very, very minute levels of personal data that embraced very detailed levels of surveillance and tracking, as you were hearing before with the face recognition video. And there was a big backlash against this high-tech corporate vision of the smart city. There was such a backlash, in fact, that the city council withdrew from the initiative. So I think in terms of all policy debates about smart cities, we need to be robust in looking at the vision, looking beyond the hype, looking at the true costs of sustaining these technologies, looking at whether these technologies are appropriate to each individual case, to the actual policy needs of a community, whether these dynamics of smart city building are highly egalitarian or highly elitist, and whether or not they embed very problematic questions of privatized governance, privatized data gathering, and privatized surveillance into sort of hidden systems of digital technology. So I have to say I'm a smart city skeptic in some ways. I'm not against the idea of digital media being enormously exciting as potential vehicles for local policy level innovation, for community policy innovation, for new economic initiatives and so on. What I'm skeptical about is that very centralized, very privatized, very corporate idea of the smart city, which is being sold around the world by very, very big tech companies, often selling a mythical and utopian vision, which is not related to what emerges. Often using the fact that municipal governments are not often very expert in the politics of digital infrastructure and digital media, and they're often very easily seduced into big smart city initiatives which end up being problematic, which end up being expensive, and which end up being inappropriate to the individual needs of their citizens. So I come at this from a sort of skeptical perspective, but I'm not rejecting the possibilities of loads of digital technologies for very creative local community initiatives. Those are very important points that have been established, and I think going back to the first question, there's no doubt that the symbolic power of a city or of a nation state claiming the smart title is huge, and it's a huge marker of developmental progress. Absolutely right. There's an anthropologist called Iwa Ong who uses the concept of worlding to describe how certain policy ideas, certain architectural ideas, certain urban ideas become a marker of a nation or a city's arrival on the world stage. And the smart city idea is hugely important, particularly amongst developing world countries for making a marker, establishing a reputation and an image, creating an attractive pull in terms of foreign direct investment, infrastructural investment, media coverage, and so on. So I'm not against this in any way at all. What I'm against is one particular idea of the smart city, not against the whole idea of the ways in which digital technologies can radically improve the economic development prospects of whole countries very, very quickly. But this is a much more progressive vision of economic development than the traditional idea of the technocratic smart city. They are two different ideas. I'm very much in favor of ideas for progressively rolling out support, skills, the technical equipment, and the infrastructural investment to entire nation states. That's a really powerful vision for economic and social modernization. And certainly the COVID pandemic has been an accelerator for a whole range of communities where the face-to-face option has been withdrawn, violently withdrawn. And the e-commerce option suddenly becomes, as you say, the only game in town. So what I would say here is that national and urban policies which build skills amongst disadvantaged communities, amongst poor communities in the less high-tech parts of cities and parts of societies, and also in the rural communities are really important. And it's really important to equalize opportunities within cities, within nation states, because so many of the dynamics of the traditional smart city are actually not in that direction. The dynamics of the corporate idea of the smart city are often very elitist, as I said before, are often very exclusionary, are often about building a high-tech sort of fortress for the wealthy minority in a gated, secured environment that is then sold as a smart city. So there are different visions of national smartness. There are progressive, equitable, redistributive models, and there are regressive, elitist, and privatized models organized towards the wealthy. So it's vital to build universalizing policies, into urban and national policy frameworks, and particularly to address the communities who find digital technology to be intimidating. There are many, particularly older communities, perhaps people in poorer communities, for which the idea of the digital world is very, very challenging and very, very difficult. But having said that, I would also stress that there does need to be democratic and social transparency to these initiatives, particularly to the surveillance aspects of the initiatives, particularly to the relationships with big technology, which are sometimes problematic and so on. So the challenge really is to build an open, a transparent, and an equitable future that perhaps is different to the traditional idea of the sort of more elitist smart city that I was criticizing initially. It's a great question. I think there's a multiple dimensions to this question. Certainly, as I say, many of the ideas of smart cities, I'm not saying the ones in Vietnam by any means, but many of the ones that are being built around the world, as I see them anyway, are far from an ideal of emancipation and human development and human flourishing, because they are so geared towards wealthy, powerful, technocratic elites. But the nature of digital technologies means there's an awful lot of flexibility. You can configure social and economic uses of digital media in a huge variety of ways. There are loads of initiatives historically over the last 30 or 40 years which focus at the grassroots level rather than being some top-down corporate IBM or Cisco type operating system. And there are a lot of initiatives at community levels which foster collaboration, which foster community and social innovation, rather than just being a sort of high-tech device imported from Portland or San Francisco. There's a whole history here of community-level technology initiatives which allow sharing, which allow people to share skills, share insights, share collaborative help at the community level, so the IT can be used in all sorts of ways. There's a whole host of initiatives which allow participation and democratic openness and democratic mobilization. And on the other hand, there are, at the other extreme, what I would see as much more problematic uses of technology, where the surveillance potential for digital technology, particularly things like face recognition, is being used to enhance highly authoritarian styles of government, highly authoritarian and controlling forms of domination and of control, which are profoundly worrying in terms. So there, to some extent, this is a social question. The technology cannot be a miracle worker. It can play a role in wider processes of innovation and governance change. But if societies want to embrace traditions of fairness, of collaboration, of openness, and of democratic potential, which I see as values which relate closely to questions of happiness, that's my personal perspective, then this is about much, much more than digital technology. This is about a wider vision of a political change and social change within which digital technology can play a role. But it's naive to think that the technology can just shape societies into these forms of living. It takes a much bigger process of political and social change to do that. And at the moment, the dynamics of development in many countries around the world, tied to the bigger sort of structures of global capitalism, unfortunately, are very unequal, very inequitable, and many of the dynamics linked to big technology and the growing role of a few big platforms like Amazon and Apple and so on. They are about taking wealth to a very, very tiny minority of very, very wealthy communities in a very, very small number of places. So this is all a political and economic and social question, I would say, and a geographical one, within which digital media play a role. But I think we need to look beyond the media and not to see them as completely shaping society. Society and technology are always in a complex two-way set of relationships. I think the initial point about the economic potentials of digital technology is very important. I mean, again, there's a very long history of building clusters of innovative small and medium-sized companies and using them through university connections and the innovation capabilities of higher education institutions to connect in very creative ways with big foreign direct investors. And there's a whole debate in the history of economic planning, economic policy making, about how that happens in particular places. So despite the proliferation of digital media, certain places remain as drivers of economic and technological innovation. And those processes are still shaped by face-to-face encounters. They're still shaped by being present in particular geographical places where the digital exchanges connect favorably with hanging out in restaurants, hanging out in cafes, being in conducive physical environments. So getting that balance right to allow the connections between the likes of Samsung and the many smaller, medium-sized enterprises and the higher education institutions is can be a very powerful thing. It can be generative of a whole economic and technological wave of growth and innovation and so on that can create a lot of work and a lot of jobs. And I've actually worked in some of those policy areas myself in the UK. But it's not always easy to create that from scratch. I think, there are many cities and nations around the world have tried to build their own Silicon Valleys. Silicon Valley in California is the original sort of father or mother of this idea where spontaneous innovation happens in very, very small ways that eventually leads to huge technological companies. Often these things start by chance. They start by serendipity, just being in the right place at the right time. And sometimes it's not always easy to engineer those sorts of economic and technological processes through policy. So it can be a challenging thing, but it can be a very rewarding thing. And I think to some extent that's a sort of separate question to the social and geographical questions that we've also been talking about the smart city being an inclusionary and equitable idea. The two are related, but they're also raise their own complexities, those two questions, I would say.